Hello War of the Visions fans, I'm Jackie Fox, and recently Ready Player Will released a very interesting video, kinda guide to the elements of randomness in War of the Visions, while also making the point generally that there was a lot more randomness lately, and that these elements of randomness were also increasing. The predictability of the game, which is something that is particularly important for content creators like himself and me, who more often look at the data and try to come up with character evaluations based on some sort of empirical idea of how this character will do in general situations. I really liked this video and I do recommend it. He does a good job with it. I'll be using stills from that throughout this video as well. But I really think that this is such a good topic that it's one that really deserves to be broken down and also focused in on. So, after my car broke down today, I had a couple of hours pacing around a mechanic's office to write the absolute thesis on chaos theory within War of the Visions. So I'm going to be breaking this into two parts, because he makes this video about randomness, and ultimately, that's just the title and the thumbnail. What he's really talking about here is unpredictability. That's the through line for him. And really, I would like to reframe this as an analysis of chaos itself. Because, there are ways to predict and model chaotic systems. It's not impossible, it is more difficult. It's definitely more difficult for an individual, like a content creator, to be able to do alone, and it makes it nearly impossible to do this based on purely anecdotal data. This is why I have, especially recently as it's become available, been interested in using more of the crowdsourced load of data on average, because at large enough numbers you can see the shape of randomness, and it ceases on a certain level to become random. It becomes more and more modelable and predictable, and if each individual fight is unpredictable, you will know that in a certain number of scenarios a certain thing is still most likely to happen. So for me, chaos, especially within this game, breaks down into two things that are actually pretty similar, but I think should be discussed separately. The first of these two things is complexity, essentially nuance and niche. This, as Ready Player Will points out, kind of negates power creep in some small ways, at least when it's combined with randomness. Because even a really weak character like Miche has the opportunity to hit you with something like Toad, and the game could go really differently for you because of that, and just this empirically weak character could potentially negate one of the strongest characters in the game, through Toad, a status that nobody really builds a resistance to because people rarely use it. Although I would actually say that this more fits into the idea of randomness itself, in that, statuses effects themselves and whether they land is a random thing that is also affected by complexity. But there's not a set thing that they're going to do every time. This is also true of complexity, and this is why it gets a little complicated. I think a really good example of complexity within modern games is Magic the Gathering. And that being said, there are still meta decks, and there is still a certain amount of predictability to who will win what matchups and how consistently. However, there is potentially even more randomness and complexity within Magic the Gathering than any other game, but also War of the Visions itself, and this doesn't stop either from being a fun game. I would say the things that are stopping Magic the Gathering from being a fun game at the moment are related to a corporation that now owns this game. But the game in and of itself is one of the most complex games known to man, if not the most definitively, and this also makes it wickedly fun in certain scenarios. This also means that in opposition to the general trend of automatic play within PvP and War of the Visions, there's also this level of how you pilot your deck and how you play with it. And this fact also adds a level of complexity and randomness. There's also the fact that Magic is played in best-of-3 matches within competitive, and hopefully this brings a little bit more of how you build and how you play to the forefront as opposed to pure randomness and complexity. Another thing that adds to this is the fact that for those last two matches, you're also sideboarding, and you may bring in cards that counter your opponent's deck or make you more consistent against them, or maybe even bring in things to counter things that you think that they may bring in from their sideboard. This makes the ultimate outcome of any individual game of Magic very complex to predict, even in a matchup that's relatively predictable. In fact, It's often played in a best of 3, and this ultimately helps avoid enough of the randomness that can ultimately be predictable as a whole as well. But at the same time, 2 decks matching up against each other could have wildly different outcomes based on who's playing them, how they play against each other, what they know about each other or their other decks, what they have in their sideboard, how they use those cards in their sideboard as well. It's a lot, but I would argue that this actually makes the game more fun and not less. And I feel a lot of the same way about complexity in War of the Visions. Now, complexity, before I get into any specific examples, isn't something that is new to War of the Visions. It also isn't just a linear climb upwards as new systems are added. There are things and were periods of time in which developmental choices actually drove down the complexity of the game. Within the game's first year and a half or so, there were definitely incentives to build elemental teams. Well, at least there was one big one, and that was that there was elemental chaining. There was also no real way to deal with elemental chaining at that time, so this was just one extra advantage that you could use in battle to push your team over the edge. That being said, strategically, you could also potentially use any combination of elements on teams of that era because all of the vision cards were universal up to a certain point. And there weren't any effects that gave buddy bonuses through master abilities either to units of the same element. Therefore, there weren't a lot of factors that were really pushing the mono-elemental teams to be the most powerful in the game in a definitive sense. In fact, for a lot of strategic reasons, they were maybe some of the weaker teams in the game. I mean, honestly, they were just easy to counter. I did use a light elemental team for a little while, but light and dark were uniquely hard to counter themselves and maybe a safer choice. But I also wasn't not trying to swap in other characters when they happened to be better. Like, for instance, when the 120 era started, one of the first characters that everyone could use was just regular Montleonis, and they gave us the resources to do it, so I pushed him to that level, and for a while he was potentially the best tank on my team and one of my better characters. And I used him with like Elsorel and Sakura, I think, mostly, because, you know, there was enough slash chaining there. There was also a lot of other good things going for that team. But a team like that, maybe at year 2, would have been completely unconventional and weak compared to other offerings. So, at least within the first year or so of the game, within the, or at least that's how it was within the first year or so of the game. With the introduction first of master abilities that gave elemental bonus to partnered characters, but also the introduction of extended bonuses for vision cards, meaning that vision cards that were originally purely universal now also had an additional bonus for a specific element, which gave you a certain incentive to build a team of cards that all benefited that element. But also around that same time, and I think even actually a little bit before it, they were introducing elemental vision cards. So with this system, you know, there were some vision cards that had 3 abilities on them, and they were really good and that remain really good, although they were held back a little bit compared to the power that were ultimately given to the max power of elemental vision cards. And these elemental vision cards would all natively have 3 abilities, but the catch compared to previous vision cards was that every one of those abilities would be activated only by a single element. And it was like this until they introduced job-based vision cards, and there are some like promotional vision cards that they've released that are, even to this day, purely universal, but that is definitely not the trend. So it was very easy to see that by playing into a system that was already strongly predictive, elemental matchups have always been a very strong indicator of success when you're going up against a mono-elemental opponent. So by playing further into this type of system and shoehorning people into designing elemental teams as the strongest real power within War of the Visions, it also decreased the complexity, at least from a predictive standpoint. Because shoehorning the game into this sort of choke point of elemental rock, paper, scissors made it ultimately less complex, and we rolled with this for years. And it's still kind of a thing, although I think that job-based VCs are taking back a better position that we haven't seen in a long time and making multi-elemental teams that have more complexity to them naturally, making those a very interesting thing within in the meta. And I think that over time, those sorts of teams will really become more dominant, especially if, say, a similar thing to what's been given to elemental teams was also applied to job-based teams. And there were job-based bonuses on master abilities or something, or once you got into Reincarnation, you would start giving these bonuses. But even then, an elemental team that all had the same jobs would also be probably the best way to go. So, as this reduction of complexity has been lifted with the introduction of job-based VCs, alongside all of this, we've had more and more mechanical systems added to the game over time. First, we get a bunch of defensive systems, which add a layer of complexity because certain characters do better against certain types of attack and have different ways of defending. We've always had a lot of these, like unit attack, area resistance, attack type resistances, defense, spirit. All these things have been in the game for quite some time. But my point is that when it's enforced by strong elemental matchups, the complexity takes a backseat to the importance of elemental matchup itself. As a break from these, and as we break away from these elemental matchups within the meta, then we're going to be moving into a point where there's more and more complexity within the game, and this leads, therefore, to less predictability. Personally, I think that in a lot of ways this creates a more fun, engaging, and dynamic type of system than just playing rock, paper, scissors. I didn't come here to play Pokemon. I came here to play a complex fantasy game that was modeled on Final Fantasy Tactics. So I feel like this feeding into just an elemental game shouldn't be the only important thing within War of the Visions. So with that out of the way, let's look at some of Ready Player World's slides. A lot of these slides actually indicate the things in different ways. So there's definitely an element of RNG in the reincarnation system, and we'll talk about that more in the next video. But the element of complexity it adds is basically just because of the UI. There's no way to tell how reincarnated a character is reliably. There's no indicator for this, and because there's no indicator for this, it's really difficult to gauge how difficult an enemy is going to be, and whether they push your team behind its thresholds, or whether or not they stay well below them. Can they surpass you, or will they not? And how much do these increases and statuses really make at the end of the fight? Those are all questions of complexity. I think counter abilities are also one of the more random things in the game, and we'll talk more about those within our randomness video. But a level of complexity has also been added to counters, as there are reaction block abilities. There's also ways to natively block reactions and the abilities to turn off other people's ability to counter as well. And whether these line up with the character before they're able to counter you is a measure of complexity. HP threshold based stats are becoming more common as well. I would say this definitely goes into complexity because it means that your characters are going to perform differently at different points in the match. And I described strategist Old Zoa as being a defensive onion, because she had so many layers of defenses and it was really hard to penetrate all of them at once, and that made her a relatively stubborn character against a wide variety of different types of teams. If I'm being really honest here, a lot of characters get a lot of levels of defense, offense, penetrations, nullifications, etc. Looking at my recent Volca video, one of her buffs provides defense, spirit, elemental resistance, and for her a barrier. That's a lot of stuff. That's essentially 2 full layers of all attack resistances. Now, to add to the complexity of this, there are attacks that are neither physical nor magical, and therefore defense and spirit aren't applied to them. I think there's only one of these that's like a main ability, but there's also a variety of non-elemental attacks that bypass the other side of her defenses from this buff. So even with this kind of onion, there's still complexity, and of course these things can be weakened and they can be dispelled as well. Some things may dispel some effects better than others. And when you add in the whole idea that all of this can change the damage calculation on a match-by-match basis and a character-by-character matchup basis, a multitude of ways at different levels of effectiveness all happening at the same time, some of which being penetrated. some of which being amplified. All sorts of crazy things are going on simultaneously, and it becomes incredibly difficult to predict when you're going to be at 70 HP or below, specifically within a fight. And a good example of this is Skahal. One of the characters get Threshold Courage. This is a form of automatic courage, and therefore has some strategic advantages over regular courage. You can't spell it, but you also can just by breaking that threshold before dealing the fatal damage. And Skahal himself is a character who can, in theory, last for ridiculous amounts of time in combat and take like 50,000 damage potentially without dying if you heal him enough. Or he can take 2 hits in a row the wrong way, and the healer just misses the whole tempo of the fight, and he goes down like an absolute punk without dealing a bit of damage. He also has a really interesting counter effect, which happens to be fairly powerful when it goes off, that also goes off before damage as well. So maybe he doesn't even take the damage because he takes somebody out with his counter anyways. And that particular element, while it adds complexity, is randomness. And is one of the biggest issues that we're going to be talking about through these 2 videos, is times when randomness and complexity line up to make things even more complicated. This creates a maximally unpredictable scenario where you have to be tracking like 20 different factors at a time to be able to even roughly predict things to begin with, but even when you do that, there's still curveballs by the way of randomness. Sealing abilities on hit are another example that I've harped on. With every mention of one of these abilities in a character review, I mention just how unreliable they are. Sure, they're great when they work, but I find it relatively uncommon that they actually do, because you've really got to line up the right character with the right other team and make sure that you hit first, and that is wildly unpredictable. Otherwise, these abilities might just be entirely pointless. On the other hand, what if they don't attack with the courage removing skill first? And then you get the second hit on them and you get the seal, and now they can't remove your courage at all. None of this is random per se. These are all things that careful planning can allow you to predict more accurately. It is the fact that this happens 100% of the time when it lines up with a preset set of conditions. That is complexity on the battlefield. You don't go into fights necessarily knowing which of these conditions are going to be important or how much they're going to play out in an individual match. And you could also look at various types of dispels and the way in which, essentially the same way when you're talking about incredibly specific dispels. These work really great in certain matches, for instance, like Joom's LB is really good at dealing with especially light right now, because 2 of its main characters both go into wider area attack defenses, and you can dispel that with Joom. You can potentially do a lot more damage to them with her kit. There's also a bevy of characters for which this does absolutely nothing. Unless they happen to have a partner on their team like Helena, the Black Rose, who can buddy buff this. In that case, any character can have this status on them, and therefore this is useful again, potentially. So simultaneously, any character can have this applied to them, while at the same time a seemingly exceedingly low number of characters actually have this ability. And even less of them, far fewer, can actually buddy buff this. So the likelihood of this going on, say, Laswell is incredibly freaking low. But you could also run into a scenario where this becomes important in a fight against Laswell. Buff weakening is another example of this. I think it's really strong because there's a lot of things in the game that count as debuffs, and every couple of months we get a new way to debuff enemy characters. And debuff weakening provides you blanket resistance from those new powerful designed characters to a certain degree in a way that's kind of across the board. I mean, this isn't really random at all if you have 100%, but most characters don't get anywhere near that, even in most scenarios. So how much does it matter that the 60% shred was only actually a 30% shred in the last given fight? Would that damage have been enough to have pushed you below your 70% threshold before someone else dealt damage to you or not? You know?
Here's another factor in the complexity and unpredictability of certain matchups. While you can mock against certain teams and get a rough idea of how they're going to perform, certain teams perform radically differently based on their formation. One of the biggest culprits here is initial hate, which is when hate is applied either through a passive or a master ability. The passives here are even trickier because sometimes a character may choose not to run this passive and therefore not have initial hate. So even if you have, for some reason, mocked against this character in this particular placement in their formation, you may not have the same results depending on if they're running the passive or not. And just to add another wrinkle to this, there's even an accessory that can give a meaningful amount of passive hate. Like a lot of abilities that can be received as passives, it's actually pretty impactful that you can get this at the very beginning of the game without having to buff it, because it can affect even the first 2 turns of setup for the opposing team in unpredictable ways. This can mean that while they've put a lot of effort into setting up their initial buffing order, you can screw all of that up just by running a character against them with initial hate. And this effect can be even worse if the character likes to buff themselves and move forward, especially if they have heightened mobility like Celeste does. You could think of hate as being a sort of gravity well around a character that will, even when they aren't in range, draw other characters nearer to them. So putting that center of gravity on the map closer to the opposing side maximizes the disruptive effect of initial hate.
Anyways, that's how I learned to stop worrying and embrace the complexity. I'm Jackie Fox, and you can find me all over the internet if you click the link in the description. But also remember that the free-to-play option for YouTube is to like, subscribe, and leave a nice comment. Tell me what you think of the video, what you think about the things that we discussed in it. Tell me some stories. I want to hear the craziest reflex story that you can possibly think of in multiple characters reflexing each other. Multiple characters reflexing the same skill at the same time. All the just craziest, what's the odds stories in the comments. Also, in that link, you can also find my main channel where I discuss the world around us. That also has an associated podcast if you just want to listen to me on your ride in the car. Also, I sell books and take donations, so if you want to check out those things, if you're into fantasy fiction, which I don't know, you might be if you're paying attention to the story of this game, or if you're into more realistic fiction, I also write that as well. Links to those books can be found in the description. But in addition to that, if you just want to throw some money to support the channel, help me buy groceries, or help me with my next set of pulls, then be sure to do that. And I think if you do it on coffee specifically, you can send me a little note with it and be like, hey, this $10 is for pulling, Fox. $10 is for pulling, and I might even film the pulls for you if you do that. I don't know, there's all sorts of ways that we could do this, but it all begins by you clicking that link in the description. Thank you so much for watching, and with all that being said, I'll see you in the next one.